Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Nina. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Down the Rabbit Hole podcast. I am here with Edgar, although he did not put a mic on himself for some reason. So I guess Edgar has nothing to say tonight. um, but thank you so much for coming and listening tonight. I want to apologize again. I guess this is turning into sort of a like Friday night every other week thing. It seems like that might be what happens with this podcast. But I also want to apologize for last week. I know we were abruptly cut off kind of during my long rant about the dystopia we had gone into. But instead of going back into that, because I did spend almost an hour talking about all the dystopian things that are happening, and while some of those things have escalated since I last streamed, I still think that it's worth it to kind of move on. I think we get the gist, you know? The governors are crazy. Some of the more intense updates, I guess, are in places like Michigan, that governor is really out of control. I mean, she banned the sale of certain flooring materials, which just seems like such a strange thing to be like, oh, your floor is not essential. So, you know, you have water damage in your floor, it is not essential to have materials to fix that. You know, weird, I don't know. Governors are just now in the place where they've just started banning shit and just hoping that reduces the spread of the virus somehow. But quite frankly, it's pretty ridiculous. So, but I'm not going to get into all of that. I'm sure that most of the people who listen to this podcast are inundated with information about all of the horrific authoritarian, fascist, communist things that are happening. So we're not going to go into that tonight. Instead, I'm going to dedicate a somewhat shorter podcast to the freedom of religion and also the state of the Catholic Church. And this is, these are the topics that I was going to talk about last week when I got cut off. But I think it's actually better that these got split up because I probably would have been talking for like 2 hours last time. So yeah, I'll just get right into it. I want to start with a brief little overview of how freedom of religion is treated here in the United States. Now, granted, everything I'm about to say doesn't apply at all right now. And that's because in a lot of states, the freedom of religion has been effectively suspended indefinitely, pending this outbreak, or the end of this outbreak. But prior to the world going mad and us all really legitimately tumbling down a rabbit hole into hell, we used to have relatively good jurisprudence on the freedom of religion. And I say relatively because with anything with the Supreme Court, they have messed up some things here and there. But a lot of the jurisprudence and a lot of what people focus on is actually the whole doctrine of separation of church and state. And that, I do think that's an important doctrine. I actually talked about that before on my podcast when I went over theocracy. But that's a lot of the doctrine that you hear people talk about with the freedom of religion, because this whole idea is that, you know, should we be putting the 10 Commandments in front of a government building or something? And so there's all these debates about whether or not that's okay, because is that really endorsing one religion over another when we're supposed to be a country that, in theory, the government's not endorsing any religion. The government should be a-religious to the extent that they can be. So that's something to think about. In terms of the actual practice of religion, for the most part, our Supreme Court has said that you cannot restrict the practice of religion in America. And there's a few exceptions to that, but they're pretty rare. It's something like, if there's some, you know, totally outside reason why your religious practice might be prohibited, then the government might say that you can't do it. And I think the best example of this is peyote or other sort of psychedelic drugs that are sometimes used in religious rituals, especially in indigenous populations. And basically what the government has said is like that might be one of their religious practices, but something, something, something drug war, right? We're going to restrict them from having that or from using peyote to the extent that they find out about it. So that's an example of that. Also, I think that there's been a few times where people were trying to have gatherings, like religious gatherings in their homes, but they ended up being sort of a nuisance to other people in the apartment building or other people on the block. And so if your religious practice becomes a nuisance to other people, then sometimes that can be restricted. But even in those cases, there's usually some Supreme Court justices that are dissenting. And just saying that, or reminding us all that part of the reason why this country exists in any way, shape, or form is because we fled Europe for the freedom of religion. There's a reason why it's in the First Amendment. It's that fundamental to our country and to our representative democracy, our republic, so to speak. So that's just kind of, I don't really want to get into all of the Supreme Court jurisprudence because as we've seen, right now it doesn't even really matter what they said because the governors, and later I'll talk about the clergy, have just, obliterated our freedom of religion. So I want to talk about it, though, from the Property Manifesto stance. So let's talk about freedom of religion as a property right. So I'm just going to, when I tried to do this with freedom of speech, I realized that my notes were crappy, and I ended up being all over the place. So I'm actually going to do this one by one, because freedom of religion is special, like the freedom of speech, wherein it actually, it's an application of property rights from all four kinds of property, being your real property, personal property, your property of body, and your property of mind. So I'm going to go through each of those in turn, and within each of those, I'll do the 6 sticks within the bundle of sticks, which for those who listen to this podcast know, those are kind of the basic property rights that go along with any one of these kinds of property. So let's start with real property because that's really easy to understand. Your real property is the land and all of the fixtures on it that you might own. So that would be your house, right? Your house is a fixture on your land, but the actual real estate itself is the plot. And so in terms of freedom of religion, if a church or if a community that, of believers goes in and buys a plot of land, they can build a church on there. And within that church, they can practice their religion however they want. And that is part of the right to possess your real property, the right to control your real property, and the right to enjoy it, right? So you can enjoy it in terms of having, if it's a Catholic church, you can enjoy it in terms of having a mass service, or maybe just, even if it's not a mass service, maybe it's a baptism or a wedding or something like that. But you can be enjoying that real property and using it for religious purposes. It's somewhat of an exclusionary right. As you've seen, there are some religions that actually do exclude from who is allowed to be participants in it. There's, let's see, cults, I don't know. Some people would not even consider those a religion. But there is a bit of an exclusionary aspect to it. If you're a group of people and you decide that on this real property where we have our church building, we really only want true believers to come in, and we have some kind of test that shows that you're a true believer or something. So in that instance, part of your freedom of religion is actually excluding people from other religious services or practices that you might be providing. The right to destroy and the right to convey, in terms of real property, this is just kind of, if you own a church on your own property, obviously you couldn't just do something like get an insurance policy and then commit arson or something like that. But if you wanted to destroy the church that's on your real property, you're within all your rights to do so. Especially one of the easiest ways to think about that is if you wanted to destroy it and then rebuild it, like do a complete remodel of the church, you have every right to destroy the church as it exists and rebuild it from the ground up. And same thing, Even if you want to sell your church, even if you've always used it as a church, but you just want to get rid of the building, we actually have a nightclub, which obviously is not operating right now, but we had a nightclub in Denver. We'll see if it still exists after all of this goes down. That was called The Church. And it really is just a former church that has been converted into a nightclub because the owner sold it. So that is your freedom of religion in terms of real property. In terms of personal property, I like to use the rosary as an example. And in hindsight, I really should have brought a rosary just so that some of my followers, if you guys don't even know what a rosary is, you could see what it is and maybe, I don't know what I mean by that. But essentially a rosary is, I was about to say a piece of jewelry, but that's really not what it is. It's more, it's a ring of beads arranged in such a manner where you use it to kind of mark what prayer you're on, and certain beads indicate that you're going to do a certain prayer, and you pray the whole thing all the way through, all the way around. And usually they're in really nice beads. Like I got one from Rome that's just beautiful. And I also have one I basically have one from every big moment in my life. I'll like buy a rosary. So a rosary is my personal property. And in terms of my freedom of religion there, the right to possess it just means that no one could steal my rosary. This would be the same thing of, like if you're a Buddhist and you have a statue of Buddha in your home, if someone steals that, it's not only that they're violating your personal property, but they're really infringing on your freedom of religion because they're taking away and stealing from you something that you use to practice your religion. So that would be a violation of your right to possess. Your right to control it and enjoy it, in terms of a rosary, is just to pray with it. That's what it means. Same thing, like I said again, if Buddha is your flavor, then then maybe you're like bowing down to Buddha or whatever, but that's your right to enjoy it. Maybe you're lighting incense or some mess in front of it, but that's your right to enjoy it, to control it, all of that. The right to exclude from personal property is really just your right against theft, which I talked about in terms of the right to possess. The right to destroy and convey. Again, I wouldn't do it because personally I would find it to be a little bit sacrilegious. But if I wanted to destroy my rosary, that is fully within my rights to do so. I mean, I could take a hammer to it. And that, like, in terms of my property and my freedom of religion, that's fully within my own rights to destroy something that I use for my practice of religion. And to convey it, I mean, people sell religious artifacts and religious goods all the time. So that's how that relates to this. Let's move on to some more fun ones. So for property of body, as you recall, for those who might not have heard my podcast before, property of body is a property right that I posit exists, which is essentially that because you own your body, you also have property rights in it, the same way you have property rights in any of your personal possessions or in your home. And the same thing for your mind, which I'll get to later. But in terms of your freedom of religion for your property of body, as we've discussed with the property of body and other rights, you're always possessing your body. You can't not, right? So that's just a matter of in terms of, because you possess your body, that gives you sort of the right to do with it what you will, including being a part of religious practices. So that gets into some of the right to control, the right to enjoy. So after, like when we go to Mass, or when one goes to Mass, there's all these rituals we do. And a lot of people think we're kind of crazy, right? I mean, I know people think Catholics are crazy. But in any event, the fact that I decide to kneel at certain times of the Mass, or that I would genuflect before I get into a pew, or even that I would light a candle on behalf of maybe someone who passed away in the chapel, or I would stay there and pray a rosary. It's like these are all choices that I'm making with my body. and it's the same thing with the right to enjoy, really. It's that you get to do those things in a positive way. It's like you get to do those things in a way where you actually like it. It's an enjoyment thing. It fulfills your soul to do that. And so that's when we get into, especially within the Catholic Church, the sacraments, such as the Eucharist and all of that. And my mother might disagree with this, but how you treat your body is somewhat almost a religious way of approaching property of body, because Christ says that your body is a temple, right? And some people take that as, you should never get any tattoos, you should never get any piercings, you should never do anything like that. But I personally view it as your body's a gift from God, and you should use it in ways that give God glory. And so I have a tattoo on my back here that is a quote from Corinthians, and it is in German. That's a really long story. But I bring it up because in some ways this is me sort of destroying a part of my body, but it's for the sake of my religion. So it's the right to destroy my body in a religious service, or in the service of a religion. And I think that this makes sense. Some religious rituals actually can be pretty brutal, and they have been going back. I think that part of the issue with the right to destroy one's body in the religious sense is that so often it's not your own individual body that's being destroyed by the religious institution, right? We have all these horrors from ancient history or whatever of people sacrificing virgins to gods, or even today we still have really brutal things going on in the world, like female genital mutilation that's done in the name of God. And so I want to make clear that your property of body does not extend to somebody else. So you do not have religious freedom to destroy someone else's property of body to fulfill your own religious goals. And it's the same thing with the right to enjoy. That only goes so far as in you're not impeding on someone else's property rights. So you can't just say, I want to enjoy my religion so much that what I'm going to do is just, I don't know, part of my religion, or I just am going to start making up things and call them religious sacraments, something like that. But maybe it just involves arson or something, So that's kind of a limit on where the enjoyment of your property of body can go in terms of religion. But in terms of the right to convey your property of body within the freedom of religion, this is sort of the priest's right to earn a living and the nun's right to kind of make money, to the extent that, not that they're owed money or money should just come to them automatically, but it's the idea that as a priest, when you are giving your services as a priest, you are actually entitled to be able to be compensated for that, because what you're conveying is religious services to your faithful. So yeah, I just think that that covers property of body pretty well. The right to exclude in terms of freedom of religion, this is sort of, in terms of your property of body, this is sort of when we get into part of the problems I have with Sharia law. Because under Sharia law, that religious institution, or whatever you want to call it, in effect forces women to cover their face when they're in public, and for religious reasons. And to me, this is a violation of your right to exclude from your body, because no one should be forcing you to cover your face. That's your body. You get to dress it how you want. And it is your religious liberty to say no to religions that you are not wanting to participate in. And so that's partially why partially why the separation of church and state is really important. It's the same thing with the property of mind aspect in this regard too, in terms of the right to exclude from. But no one can impose, or rather, they can, but they would be violating their your rights if they did impose, mandatory behaviors, actions, garments, yada yada, for the sake of their religion. Because you can say, no, that's not my religion though, and I have the right to exclude you from my body, especially as it comes to religious matters. And then, property of mind, the bundle of sticks here, just like property of body, you always possess your mind no matter what. So that's just kind of an always present thing. But with the right to control here, this is what I talked about when I discussed property of mind briefly, but the right to control in terms of the freedom of religion is the right to, within your own consciousness, come to your own conclusions regarding your spirituality, your, eternal life or lack thereof, your morality, all of that. That's your property of mind, your right to control your property of mind, and that's where that aspect of freedom of religion comes from. The right to exclude from, this is kind of what I was starting to get to in property of body, right? No one can force you to don religious attire that you do not ascribe to and that you do not want to wear. It's a violation of your property of body. Similarly, and so many martyrs have been in this position, right, where they're on their knees with either a machete or a gun to their head, and they're basically told to denounce Christ, and they won't do it, and then they're put to death. But those are individuals exercising the right to exclude from their property of mind as far as their religion goes, and they pay the ultimate price for it in those instances. The truth is that these property rights that I talk about on this podcast are not protected like they should be. So the other thing with the right to exclude here is the freedom to be an atheist if you want. All of these people, including me, right? It's like, I'll be like, it's so good for you to be a Christian. It'll do great things for your soul and like your life and whatever. And pretty much every religion assumes that they have the right way. Otherwise, they wouldn't ascribe to that religion, right? So if you are an atheist, if you're an agnostic, your property right to exclude from your mind is sort of the basis of why you can be an atheist. Because what you're saying is, I can block all of that out of my mind. I don't have to listen to your religious beliefs. I don't have to take in what you have to say. I don't have to listen to your sermon. I don't have to listen to your religious podcast where you're going to rant about the Pope and all this mess in a minute. But that's your property of mind, the right to exclude from your property of mind in a religious context. Let's see. In terms of enjoyment, this is kind of more, instead of what I talked about before, where it's like sacraments, you go in and you have confession. That's partially your body. You're going in, you're speaking, you're doing that. If you get the Eucharist, you actually go in, you receive the body and blood of Christ presently, all of that good stuff. But in terms of your property of mind, it's more so, this is your enjoyment's more your right to meditate and to pray within your own consciousness, wherever you may be. Even on the way over here, I said a prayer just that I would not make an imbecile of myself tonight when I was speaking, and that I wouldn't say anything too terribly stupid. But that was a prayer. I said it in my own mind, and that was my right to enjoy my own mind in a religious context, and we all have that right. It's part of our property of mind. So the right to destroy in terms of your property of mind and religion. This is sort of what I was dabbling with talking about cults, but I'll get into a little bit. But the whole idea here is you have the right to destroy your mind with really bizarre religious ideas if you want. Like there's some religions that, so there's some of the nicest people that I've ever met, but like when I dig into their religious beliefs, I'm just like, whoa. So, if you want to be like a Scientologist or something, or like, dare I say like a Mormon, there's a lot of Mormons in Colorado, or like, any of these religions that people have a lot of skepticism about and might, be unnecessarily critical of you and what you believe. Even if I or anyone else thinks that those religious beliefs are bizarre or detrimental or whatever, it is still your right to believe them. Even if I think it's destroying your mind and like your soul to believe them, it is still your right to do that if you so choose. So that's just one thing to consider with that. And then finally, the right to convey your property of mind as it pertains to religion is really, this is just your ability to make a profit off of your religious ideas and musings. So if I ever memorialized all of my thoughts about faith or about Christianity, about the Eucharist into a book, and then publish that and then sell it, I mean, that's really me selling my property of mind, my religious property of mind, right? Because it's a religious book. It's coming from my religious aspect of my heart. So that's kind of how freedom of religion comes into being from a property rights sense. And you can see that some of the things that our governments are doing right now are just obliterating all of the rights I just described, okay? So in terms of real property, we have churches that own real property that are not allowed to gather there anymore. If they are, it has to be like, I actually think that our current order says that it doesn't matter how many people. You're just not supposed to be gathering together in any number of people if it's non-essential, which I still don't understand how the freedom of religion can be non-essential when it's in the Bill of Rights. Like it's in the first damn amendment. In case you thought that your Constitution mattered. Anyway, but I just think that it's important to acknowledge basically all four aspects, or all four property rights in terms of the freedom of religion are being infringed upon right now by our governors. We can't use the real property that churches own to conduct church services. Within my own home, I can use my rosary and pray, but I'm not allowed to go sing with the choir anymore, so I can't use my choir book the way that I'd like. My property of body, in that same way, I'm not allowed to sing with the choir anymore. So I'm not allowed to use my body to sing for, like, my Lord, right? I'm not allowed to do it. I mean, I could do it at home, I suppose, but it's like I have to do it in private now. It all has to be privately done. I can't get the Eucharist at all. So I think that's a pretty big restriction on my property of body. And to be honest, it's not even the government that's doing that. It's our bishops that have done that. And that's a whole other alarming thing that I'm going to get into in a minute here. And also just the property of mind situation, I just think that I've basically received, on my Twitter, I have received death threats. I have received basically statements saying that they hope I catch the virus and die. Someone actually said that they hoped that I catch the virus and that someone I love dies. And I thought that that was pretty fucked up. But it was all just because I have been so upset over the cancellation of masses. And I just think that we, as a society, we are too scared to to just do things that we have always done, man. Like, we're so scared now that we're not even going to go to church. And church, or at least in the Catholic Church, it's not just that we go and sit in the Mass just to go listen to the priest talk for an hour. We're there because, first of all, yeah, it's nice to hear the readings, of course, because so many Catholics really don't pick up a Bible at all, and so the only time they actually hear Scripture is when they're in Mass. But it's also so that when the priest does the sacrifice of the consecration, that the faithful are there to support him. And thereby, the faithful are able to participate in the spoils, so to speak, of the sacrifice, which is that we get to get Eucharist and the precious body and blood. So all of this is just for me to say that our religious liberties are just so demolished right now. I mean, we can't... I saw this heartbreaking video of a priest. I don't even know what state he was in. But he was determined to do masses on Holy Week. And so it was just so sad looking. It was kind of pitiful. But he rented a U-Haul and he put it in a parking lot and he set up an altar inside of the U-Haul and he had everyone show up in their cars. So social distancing or whatever, right? So it was just a parking lot full of all these cars. He was speaking in a loudspeaker from a U-Haul giving Mass. Meanwhile, in certain states, priests were trying to give communion out in like a drive-by fashion. It's like, oh, well, you can just come by and get it. We'll pass it to you through the window. And police officers showed up there and basically said, you can't do this. All of your rights are currently suspended. So that's pretty freaking wild. So just, the freedom of religion it's in a scary place right now. And Bill Gates and all of his wisdom and, billions of dollars or whatever, was on an interview recently. I think it was on ABC News or NBC News, but he was saying, things like schools, things that really matter, we can probably get those back sooner rather than later. But, things like Mass services, he specifically went after the Catholics. Things like Mass services, those might take a really long time to come back, if they come back at all. So, just be aware that there's plenty of people in our society who would love to make it so that, whether or not you can celebrate your freedom of religion is not a matter of, am I making a public nuisance? Am I, am I taking like really hard illegal drugs? Even though, I still think that the shamans or whatever, just let them have their peyote, man. Like, who cares? But in any event, it's gotten to a point where now the combination of the freedom of assembly and the freedom of religion are so infringed upon right now, where even if I just wanted to have, like, if I could convince a priest to disobey the bishops, which is a whole other thing, but if I could convince a priest to do that, it'd be a situation like I bring 10 people up in there, and that would still be illegal. I couldn't have a Mass with 10 people sitting 20 feet away from each other. And it's just crazy. So with that, I'll transition into what I want to talk about here in terms of the clergy, which is my second subject tonight. And I'll try not to dwell on this for too long because I have already touched on some of this. But I want to make clear, like, while I am really concerned about the freedom of religion, because there really are some states who are actively trying to suppress the sacraments and the Mass and things like that, and it doesn't seem like Jared Polis is as focused on that necessarily, even though he's restricted it. But the fact of the matter is, before Jared Polis even locked everything down, Jared Polis is our governor of Colorado. He did, what he did instead was say, well, everything's banned except for gatherings of 250 or less. And in response to that, the bishops just canceled all Masses in the entire state of Colorado. Now, I don't know how many of you guys go to Mass, okay? But I can tell you that I have not been to a Mass attended by more than 250 people outside of Christmas and Easter morning, of course. I haven't been to a Mass attended that well, and I can't even remember. And especially the daily Masses, I mean, there might be like 20 people there if they're lucky. But our bishops, the Archbishop of Denver, Archbishop Aquila, he met with the other bishops here in Denver and just decided, you guys don't get to have Mass. You don't get to have the Eucharist, period. And I'm not sure exactly which individual within the archdiocese or diocese have made these statements to these priests, but I've been very alarmed to find out that a local priest in Denver was trying to conduct Masses outside. He had everyone standing 6 feet apart, and he kept the Mass attendance to under 250 people, which was really easy to do because only 30 or so people showed up to the Mass that he advertised. But he was directed specifically by the Archdiocese of Denver that he was not allowed to do that. It wasn't from the government, it was from the church. Similarly, I have been trying to, and it was so sad, I had to have Easter without going to Mass. I usually go to Good Friday. I like to go to Holy Thursday if I can, but I have not missed an Easter Mass in my entire frickin' life. But I was not allowed to go this year. And I was trying to figure out a way just to get some Eucharist so that my family and I could have some on Easter Sunday. So I asked around, and I found out that the priests, again, I'm not exactly sure who within the archdiocese told them this, but the priests were told that they actually are not even allowed to consecrate extra hosts for the sake of distributing out to the faithful. And that's really alarming to me. The priest I spoke to said that he couldn't even if his own mother requested to have one extra host made for her, he couldn't do it. Now, I was so upset about this that I actually listened in on a Q&A with the Archbishop of Denver, Archbishop Aquila, and I put in a question. I feel like they dodged it, personally. I can't prove that, but they didn't listen to my question even though I was the first person in to give questions. But one woman asked, and rightly so, she said, I work in an elderly healthcare facility. And we have people here who are at risk of death. Some of them do have the coronavirus. And they have been trying to get a priest just to come in here to give their last rites and to give them their last sacraments so they can die with, their heart at peace. And she said that she had heard that there was some limitation on the Eucharist. And she just wanted to know what was being done to prioritize that. And instead of answering this woman's question, which is very genuine to me, right? She's worried that there are faithful people dying who want to have their last rites on their deathbed. And instead of acknowledging her concerns, what our Archbishop said was, priests can consecrate as many hosts as they want, which is a lie. That's actually not true, as we found out from priests who said that they couldn't even do one for their mother. But then he just brushed off the whole question. He said, they can consecrate as many hosts as they want. I'm not sure who gave you this misinformation, but, what's the next question? So that's the Archbishop of Denver flagrantly disregarding the fact that there are people within his archdiocese that are risking death without being in a state of grace. And those are souls that are on his hands, in my opinion. But for my last few minutes here, because I'll get off here in about 10 minutes, I just want to talk about our Pope. He is terrible. He is just awful. I mean, every Pope you could be critical of for various things. Even Pope John Paul II, now Pope John Paul the Great, they've kind of upgraded him in his terminology. But, there's still things to be critical of there. But this Pope, I mean, What a train wreck. This guy, I do not believe that he is Catholic. Now, I could be wrong. I don't know what's really in his heart. Only God knows that. But he's made public statements questioning the divinity of Christ. He basically allowed a golden idol of some kind of Amazonian Mother Earth goddess to be put in St. Peter's Basilica, which some brave cardinal, by the way, grabbed the golden, I was gonna say the golden calf, but it's not exactly a golden calf, but close enough, right? But grabbed this golden Mother Earth goddess and threw it into the Tiber River. Like, he grabbed it from St. Peter's Basilica, ran all the way to the river, and threw it in there. So it's gone now. But I mean, this Pope, he basically kind of endorses moral relativism in many ways. He kind of implies that any church can kind of get you to salvation. And the truth is, I'm sure there's plenty of people who believe that. I bet there's even Christians who believe that. But maybe if you're the frickin' Pope, you might want to be pretty confident that your faith is the right one, yeah? Anyway, so I just want to talk a little bit about a specific instance of the Pope, and then I will call it a night. So before my terrible bishops outlawed masses here in Colorado, the Pope, he basically said Easter's not happening in the Vatican City this year. And that hasn't happened, to my knowledge, since Napoleon invaded Rome, that there has not been a Triduum, set of masses happening at the Vatican. So after he did that, rightly, there was a lot of outrage from the Catholic community, and a lot of people feeling abandoned by God, abandoned by their church, whatever. And so I do think Pope Francis realized that this was kind of negative press. And so he decided to do this day of adoration where everyone was supposed to come and pray with him at the same time, and then he would set up adoration that would be live streamed for a certain amount of time so that the faithful all over the world could see the Eucharist and be a part of it. And he started this by reading from the Gospel. And I'm just going to read it to you real quick here. It's a Gospel reading from Mark chapter 4, verse 35. The calming of the storm at sea. On that day, as evening drew on, he said to them, "Let us cross to the other side." Leaving the crowd, they took him with them in a boat just as he was, and other boats were with him too. A violent squall came up, and waves were breaking over the boat, so that it was already filling up with water. Jesus was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. They woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up, rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, "Quiet, be still." The wind ceased, and there was great calm. Then he asked them, "Why are you terrified? Do you not yet have faith?" They were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this whom even the wind and sea obey?" Okay? And in response, after he has this reading, he does this whole homily where he talks about how we as churchgoers can't be afraid. Listen to how Christ scolds the apostles for having so little faith and being afraid that the storm would be okay in the end. Simultaneously, Homie is standing there in an empty St. Peter's Square because everyone is so freaking scared to come out of their homes that he's there alone. And it's by his own doing that they're too scared to be there. Because I don't know if you guys have seen previous speeches or, homilies given by the Pope in other years, but I mean, St. Peter's Square is packed. There are thousands of people there. And so in this grandstanding homily about how we can't be afraid because we have to trust in Christ that even if we go through storms, we will be okay. And it's like, you don't trust in Christ right now. This is a time of crisis, and instead of trusting in Christ, you called off Easter Mass a month before it was going to happen. And there's a lot of problems with canceling Holy Week Masses, okay? In addition to the fact that it's the most holy week of the year and the Pope should give a damn about that, it's also a major problem in that on Holy Saturday, this is the night where this Mass lasts for hours, all right? I've never actually sat through one because they last so long. But on Holy Saturday is the day that all of the people who have been waiting to get baptized, waiting to get their first communion, waiting to get their why can't I think of it? Either their, why can't I think of it? See, this is my migraine medicine. Their confirmation. Hopefully my mother's not watching this. I'm going to get disowned. But yeah, also, there's thousands of Catholics all over the world, or to-be Catholics, soon-to-be Catholics, who were expecting last Saturday to finally be part of the Catholic Church, to finally be able to get the sacraments that they've spent a year learning about, or more, trying to get access to. And the Pope unilaterally just says, anyone who is going to get the sacraments on Holy Saturday in all of Rome and all of the Vatican, doesn't get to become part of the Catholic Church. And a lot of bishops throughout the country, luckily our bishops aren't this crazy. We still have baptisms that you can have. We still have the possibility to go to confession. The Eucharist is greatly restricted, which is what I care about the most, and that's why I'm so upset about it. But our bishops aren't so horrible, whereas some bishops have legitimately said that all baptisms, including emergency baptisms to be done at the time of someone's death, are, suspended indefinitely. To give you a hint of how crazy that is, anyone, even a non-believer or not, can perform an emergency baptism, okay? So that means that, if someone is in a car accident on the side of the road, and they suddenly, in that moment, their life is flashing before their eyes or whatever, in that moment, they want to become a Christian. And they have someone there who's, aiding them, and they say, I want to be baptized. Will you please, find some water or something to do that? Even if that person's an atheist, he can still perform an emergency baptism because that person is in an emergency situation where they're about to die, man, and they want to do something to protect their soul. So the emergency baptism has always been allowed. It's the broadest possible sacrament that we have. The only prerequisite to an emergency baptism is to ask for one in an emergency. That's it. And in some jurisdictions, priests are not allowed to do this. In some jurisdictions, the bishops have instructed the priests that they are not even allowed to visit the sick, which is mandated by the corporal works of mercy. I mean, in essence, the priests are being told by the bishops that they cannot give sacraments to the faithful, whether it be baptism in some of these places where they've completely outlawed emergency baptisms, or whether it be here in Colorado where I can't get the Eucharist no matter how hard I try and I'm so pissed off about it, or whether it be those states where marriages are indefinitely suspended. They weren't giving funerals to some of these people, so people don't even get to have the last rites at their funeral. And all of this is over a virus, which I just saw an article today. It came out of California, where they did a blind study with decent controls, but in essence, they're showing that the infection rate is already about 50 to 80 times higher than what we thought it was in terms of how many people have been exposed and infected. But the death toll is also 50 to 80% lower than what everyone's been saying as well. Because a lot of the people, the vast majority of people who are getting tested now are finding that they just have antibodies already to the virus. But it doesn't matter. My freedom of religion is still gone. So, I just want to bring this up because it's actually not as if my governor, whom I despise so much, it's actually not him that is restricting my freedom of religion this way. It is our clergy that's doing this. And what really alarms me about that is, I don't know how familiar my listeners are with Prohibition, but during Prohibition, the Catholic Church fought the government and said, no, the Eucharist is too important. We're going to have wine that we're going to consecrate at our masses, and you can't stop us. That's what they did, and they got an exception. They got an exception to the rule of Prohibition to be able to have the precious blood in Mass, which starts as wine before it's consecrated. So, and you know, the Catholics at the time who fought for that were treated horribly. There was a presidential candidate during Prohibition who was running, trying to get Prohibition repealed, or, you know, to get that amendment, gotten rid of, so to speak. And he was a Catholic. He wanted Prohibition over because he thought it violated our freedom of religion. And he, on his drives, like, he would drive to his various campaign locations, and people would just light burning crosses along the way because he was arguing against Prohibition. And now we all look back at Prohibition like, wow, how stupid that was. And it was. But we haven't learned any of those lessons from Prohibition anyway. I mean, we have more substances prohibited now than ever before, which is why we have a lot of gang violence. We have a lot of cartel stuff happening on the Mexican border, all that stuff. And it's the same with anything that you ban. As soon as you ban something, there's going to be a black market for it. But I point this out because that was a long time ago. That was about 100 years ago. But even then, it was understood that, or at least among our clergy, it was understood that the Eucharist is the most important thing, and we will risk arrest to make sure that our faithful can get it. And I just pray, I've teased, and I'm sorry, Edgar, I know I'm running up against the clock here. I've teased that the government and my bishops have achieved what my mother has been trying to get me to do since I was 12 years old, which is to pray a rosary every single day. But it's because my freedom of religion has been obliterated. My right to assemble is gone, and my bishops and my clergy don't even care. And my priests, there's some great priests who really have a lot of courage. Father Sam Moorhead, really, I thank you so much for trying to bring the sacraments to the faithful in Denver. But, a lot of our priests just don't have the courage to fight back. And so those of us who are Catholics, who do care about the Eucharist and not just being able to hear a sermon on Sunday, we really need to be praying. I wrote a very scathing letter to my bishop that I hope he reads and understands, but he'll probably just throw it away. But we need to make known that the sacraments matter. The sacraments are an integral, essential part of the practice of our faith, and we are not going to go down lightly with this. And if there are priests out there that have considered doing like a catacomb mass and don't know if it would be popular, feel free to contact me. You can email me at ninadowntherabbithole. I think that's my email address. Maybe it's downtherabbithole1776@gmail.com. Either way, it's at Gmail. It's one of those two email addresses. I will check it. Edgar's laughing his ass off at me over here. But really, if you're in Denver, if you're a priest, if you'd be interested in doing a catacomb mass on the hush hush, you can contact me privately. I promise I will not publicize you or make it a big thing. I'll respect your privacy. But with that, I will call it a night. Thank you so much, everyone who tuned in to listen tonight. The chat was really quiet. Maybe it's just because everyone is living in a dystopia. I don't know. But thank you so much for tuning in. If you do want to support this podcast, you can become a patron on patreon.com/NinaDownTheRabbitHole. And that actually is right, Edgar. I know that one for sure. Thank you, Brett, for being my first patron. I always appreciate the support that you give this channel. Also, I want to give a shout out to Guns for Everyone and, of course, to Edgar. Guns for Everyone is really what makes this podcast possible. They let me work in the studio and use all this equipment to bring this out to you guys. So please support them however you can. If you're here in Colorado, that means that you can take a concealed carry class from them. You can get a free concealed carry class from them, actually. They also have other classes that help you to learn how to train with your firearm. I'm probably going to take one a little bit later this month. Those have been deemed essential, so woot. But also he has standalone stores and all that, so if you want to purchase firearm or accessories, you can always find a Guns for Everyone store here in Denver and purchase a firearm that way. But again, the best way to support me and support this podcast, if you want to, is just to share it with as many people as you think would be willing to listen to my long, rambling talks about current events, property rights, and a little bit of religion now and then. But I really hope that you all are doing okay. I hope that none of you are sick. And if you are sick with the virus, that you recover quickly. And more than anything, I hope that you all are keeping your sanity together, because all of us get cabin fever after a long enough time. But anyway, I hope you all have a great week, 2 weeks maybe, and be free, guys. Good night.